This is Pacifica Radio's Letters and Politics. On today's show,
after 9/11, the U.S. dropped flyers over Afghanistan and said, we'll pay you for Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters. And so Afghans who were very poor pretty much grabbed anyone, and Pakistanis too, pretty much grabbed anyone who was not local, who was not somebody they knew, or a tribal enemy, and brought them to the U.S. military and said, here's an Taliban or an al-Qaeda fighter, and we purchased those people. We paid $3,000 to $5,000 a person for each of those people, or for most of those people. And so Afghans and Pakistanis got rich selling these people to us, and we took them all because apparently Cheney wanted to fill up Guantanamo, which we'll talk about why they was chosen, to show he was tough. But anyway, that's who many of these people are. They're people who were grabbed and sold to us.
We continue our look at the expansion of presidential war powers over the decades by looking specifically at Guantanamo Bay, where detainees in the war on terrorism have been held now for some 18 years. Our guest is Peter Jan Honigsberg. Peter Jan Honigsberg is professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law and founder and director of Witness to Guantanamo. He is the author of the book, A Place Outside the Law, Forgotten Voices from Guantanamo. That's next on Letters and Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Eileen Alfandary. With their footsteps echoing in the hallways and cameras recording the moment, the 7 House members who will serve as prosecutors in the Senate impeachment trial walked into the Senate chamber. House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff read the 2 articles of impeachment against Trump, starting with abuse of power. He outlined the charge that Trump pressured Ukraine's president to announce an investigation of his Democratic opponents by withholding military aid and a desired White House meeting.
Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell recessed the Senate until 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time, when 4 U.S. senators will escort Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts to the chamber. Roberts will swear in the senators as jurors for the trial, which is scheduled to get underway next Tuesday. Earlier, McConnell decried House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's decision to hand out souvenir pens yesterday after she signed the resolution to transmit the impeachment charges to the Senate. McConnell said it's now the Senate's turn to, quote, break factional fevers before they jeopardize the government's core institutions.
This body, this chamber exists precisely, Madam President, so that we can look past the daily dramas and understand how our actions will reverberate for generations. So that we can put aside animal reflexes and animosities and coolly consider how to best serve our country. The House's hour is over. The Senate's time is at hand. It's time for this proud body to honor our founding purpose.
Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine is leading an effort among some Republicans, including Utah's Mitt Romney, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, to consider Senate witnesses. She told reporters she's satisfied the rules will allow votes on that. The federal government's watchdog agency says a White House office violated federal law in withholding military aid to Ukraine. The Government Accountability Office said in a report that the Office of Management and Budget violated the Impoundment Control Act in delaying the military aid Congress authorized for Ukraine for policy reasons rather than technical budgetary needs. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi quoted from the key finding.
These are the words of the GAO. Faithful execution of the law does not permit the president to substitute his own policy priorities for those that Congress has enacted into law. The Office of Management and Budget withheld funds for a policy reason which is not permitted under the Empowerment Control Act. The withholding was not a programmatic delay. Therefore, we conclude that OMB violated the Empowerment Act. The OMB, the White House, the administration broke the law.
Fresh details have emerged about President Trump's efforts in Ukraine. A close associate of President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, claimed that Trump was directly involved in the effort to pressure Ukraine to publicly announce an investigation of Democratic rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Lev Parnas says he delivered an ultimatum in May to the incoming president of Ukraine that no senior U.S. officials would attend his inauguration and the vital U.S. military aid would be withheld if an investigation into Biden was not announced. Parnas appeared on MSNBC with Rachel Maddow.
President Trump knew exactly what was going on. He was aware of all of my movements. I wouldn't do anything without the consent of Rudy Giuliani or the president.
The new accusations came as House Democrats made public a trove of documents, text messages, and photos from Parnas' smartphones that appeared to verify parts of his account. The messages show that Robert Hyde, a Republican candidate for Congress from Connecticut, disparaged former Ukraine Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch in messages to Parnas and gave him updates on her location and cell phone use. The Democratic chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee said the messages are profoundly alarming and suggest a possible risk to Yovanovitch's security in Kiev before Trump ordered her recalled from her post. Ukrainian police announced they have opened an investigation into the possibility that Yovanovitch came under illegal surveillance. 6 national organizations, which say they represent millions of progressive activists, have joined forces to issue a unity statement in the wake of the controversy over a 2-year-old meeting between presidential candidates Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. The two have differed over whether Sanders told Warren a woman couldn't beat Donald Trump. CNN, meantime, released video of the brief off-mic conversation between the two immediately following Tuesday night's debate.
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
What?
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
Let's not do it right now. You want to have that discussion? We'll have that discussion. You called me. You told me. All right, let's not do it now.
The progressive groups say the surest way to defeat Trump is for the Democratic Party to nominate either Warren or Sanders, as these are the candidates best able to energize voters by providing a vision of a decent society and a fair economy. Their statement says that Sanders and Warren, as well as their campaigns and supporters, will need to find ways to cooperate. The crossfire amplified by the media is unhelpful and does not reflect the relationship between two Senate colleagues who broadly worked well together for most of the last year, the statement says. The signing organizations are Our Revolution, the Sunrise Movement, and RootsAction.org, all of which support Sanders, the Working Families Party, which supports Warren, and Justice Democrats and Democracy for America, which currently do not support any presidential candidate. In a series of tweets, Minnesota Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who supports Sanders, also weighed in, saying that Trump, corporate media, and billionaires want progressives pitted against each other. She added, pitting progressives against each other weeks before the Iowa caucus hurts all of us. Yesterday, the hashtags Warren is a snake and Never Warren were trending. Some prominent progressives say they believe that Russian bots and Trump's social media were amplifying the hashtags. The Senate overwhelmingly approved a new North America trade agreement that rewrites the rules of trade with Canada and Mexico and gives President Trump a major policy win before senators turn their full attention to his impeachment trial. The vote was 89-10. It now goes to Trump for his signature. It would replace the North America Free Trade Agreement known as NAFTA. The AFL-CIO endorsed the measure, as did scores of business and farm groups. The biggest holdouts were environmental organizations, which said the deal does not address climate change. 1 Republican, 8 Democrats, and Bernie Sanders voted no. 2 U.S. agencies say the decade that just ended was by far the hottest ever measured on Earth, capped off by the second warmest year on record. Scientists say there's no doubt at all this is due to human activity. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration said the 2010s averaged 1.4 degrees Celsius higher than the 20th century average and more than 1/3 of a degree warmer than the previous decade, which had itself been the hottest on record. Omar Badur is a senior scientist with the World Meteorological Association, which has urged dramatic action to address the climate crisis.
Heat waves, floods that have droughts that have impacted people around the world in terms of migration of people because of drought, in terms of internal displacement because of floods. Wildfires have been also one of the most noticeable events during 2019, even in areas where fires are very rare, like in the Arctic region.
Several scientists said the coming years will be even hotter. Georgia Tech climate scientist Kim Cobb said 2020 is off to a horrifying climate start, and I fear what the rest of the year will bring to our doorsteps. Iran's president said there's no limit to the country's enrichment of uranium following its decision to abandon its commitments under the 2015 nuclear deal. That move came in response to the assassination of top Iranian general in a U.S. airstrike in Iraq earlier this month. In a speech before the head of banks, President Hassan Rouhani said the nuclear program is in a better situation than it was before the nuclear agreement with world powers. His remarks appeared on Al Jazeera.
When the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal, we contacted the other parties and expressed our preparedness to fulfill our obligations. However, today we, in terms of the nuclear power, we have no limits. We are in a much better situation compared to before the deal.
Last summer, Iran began openly breaching limitations of the agreement after President Trump unilaterally withdrew the U.S. and imposed damaging sanctions. Iran has urged the European Union to find ways to mitigate the effects of the sanctions. Virginia Democratic Governor Ralph Northam says he's declaring a state of emergency over threats from militia groups ahead of a gun rights rally next week. Northam's emergency order will ban weapons of all kinds, including firearms, from the Capitol grounds starting Friday because of potential violence. He said some of the rhetoric used by groups planning to attend the rally is similar to what was said in the lead-up to the deadly 2017 white nationalist rally in Charlottesville. And Virginia has become the 38th and final state needed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Opponents, though, have vowed to wage a court battle, pointing to a 1982 deadline set by Congress. I'm Eileen Alfandary. Letters and Politics is next.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to continue our look at issues around executive power, and in particular, again, continuing with the issue of executive power when it comes to war. It's always been an argument on this radio program that what we've seen during the age of Donald Trump is a product of many decades of this drift towards what we would call an imperial presidency. Well, today we're going to do it through the lens of Guantanamo Bay, as we just passed the 18th anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo Bay as a detention facility in the war on terrorism. Joining me in the studio for this conversation is Peter Jan Honigsberg. He's a professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law and founder and director of Witness to Guantanamo, which they have done a number of interviews with people who work and have been detained, and guards, just about everyone you could think of who have had to spend considerable time at Guantanamo Bay. He is the author of the book, A Place Outside the Law, Forgotten Voices from Guantanamo. Peter Jan Honigsberg, it's my very good pleasure to welcome you to our radio station.
Thank you, Mitch. My pleasure to be here.
When we talk about executive power, and again, we have been talking a lot about executive power on this radio program because of the killing of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. But of course, executive power, especially when we talk about war, means a lot of things. Is there, in your mind, a connection to Guantanamo Bay?
Well, absolutely. When President Bush open Guantanamo, that was clearly executive commander-in-chief executive power, and they deliberately chose a place that they felt was outside the law, which again was his power. He also declared in February 2002 that the Geneva Conventions don't apply to Guantanamo. So yes, the executive has a lot of authority and has used it, and Bush used it, and we can go into how Obama has used it. So absolutely, there's a continuum. It goes back, of course, before Bush. It goes back Jimmy Carter before that, Roosevelt when he...
Jimmy Carter?
Well, with Iran, when he, with the helicopter, and he tried to come in and save the
hostages.
Yeah, hostages. And of course, when President Roosevelt interned the Japanese Americans back in World War II, that was using executive power as well. I mean, war power, and that, of course, was very questionable. And it took 6 years before they apologized. So presidents have always used that power, and sometimes for the good, sometimes not for the good.
For Guantanamo Bay, is there a precedent before 2002? I know it was once a place where Haitian migrants?
Haitians and Cubans would come to and would be held there, but it was not a detention center in the way that we understand Guantanamo Bay is post 9/11.
Was it outside the law, the way it would be after 2002?
When?
For Haitians and Cubans who were held there?
Well, I think they were held there, and I don't know much about this, Mitch, but I believe that President Clinton was trying to keep them there so they wouldn't come into the U.S., right? So on some level, you could say that was outside the law. He could be vetting them. He could have been trying to keep them from coming into the U.S. But it was not seen as a place of torture, both psychological, actually more than physical torture in Guantanamo, and, a place that is a really black stain on America, which the detention center is post 9/11.
So looking at Guantanamo Bay post 9/11, is this made what the president did, what George W. Bush did? First off, he created through executive order. That's what you said earlier.
Well, yeah, and as commander-in-chief, he took a naval base, so he was the commander-in-chief. He could take a naval base and do what he wanted with it, which is make a detention center for the detainees. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what. Did Congress? Did Congress ever weigh in about the legality of Guantanamo Bay?
Not that I understand. There was no legislation on that. Well, it was challenged because of the detainees, as you know, were tortured in Guantanamo and were held in isolation, were held in incommunicado, and lawyers on the outside challenged the holding of these men, and eventually went to the Supreme Court in 2004. And shockingly, the Supreme Court actually took the case, and more shockingly, it decided in favor of the detainees, and they had a statutory right to challenge the detentions in a habeas hearing in federal court. The Bush administration didn't like that and went to Congress and asked them to pass a law that would essentially avoid the habeas right in federal court and use of administrative hearings in Washington, D.C. that could essentially be a kangaroo court and not provide the hearings that the men were entitled to. So Congress did weigh in subsequently in helping the Bush administration to continue the process of not giving the men the absolute right to habeas hearings. And then it had to be challenged again. And it wasn't until 2008 when the Supreme Court weighed in and said there was a constitutional right to habeas that there finally was this right, absolute right to go to federal court. But for years, the federal government, the Bush administration, did try to block it, and Congress did assist in 2005 after that decision in 2004.
And what happens after 2008? They never really, the detainees still there, never really get their day in a federal court.
Well, they did and they didn't. One of the really sad things about American law that came through here was that every detainee who did have a hearing in federal court, ultimately, if they won, it was appealed to the Court of Appeals D.C. Circuit, and they tend to overturn those and favor the U.S. government if there was a, quote, scintilla of evidence on behalf of the federal government. And as a consequence, the lawyers who represent detainees will tell you, if you interviewed any of them, will tell you that no matter how hard they tried and how much good work they did, at the end of the day, it was the U.S. government decided whether these men would be released or not, and not the courts. And so over and over again, the men were released for reasons that were political. I explained some of that, and not because they won their day in court and the judge said, you're now released. And judges also were afraid to release the men because they didn't want to be accused of releasing a, quote, terrorist, even though these men, most of them were not. So judges wouldn't make that decision. The Court of Appeals would support the U.S. government. And so ultimately the U.S. administration, Bush administration on its own and Obama administration on its own released these men. And Obama fought against releasing them by the courts too, not only Bush.
Yeah. How many people are at Guantanamo Bay now? 40?
40, that's correct.
Who's there? Who's still there?
Well, there's
Do we know?
Yes, we know all of them. 26 are who they call forever prisoners. That means
They call them forever prisoners.
They call them forever prisoners. It's likely they're going to die there. Never been charged with a crime. They've been held there for almost 2 decades now. Never been charged with a crime, never prosecuted, never tried, and never convicted. And that's probably going to continue until they die. And the reason why they're being held there still is because the U.S. government has, quote, evidence against them that they obtained through torture, so they can't use that evidence to prosecute them, and they feel these men are too dangerous to just release, like they've released most of the people in Guantanamo by now. And so they're just holding them with absolutely no right under the law. I mean, in fact, we're the only, with some UN rapporteur on torture told us that no country in the world has ever held men for as long as we held without charges and detention. And these 26 men are being held like that, and they're there, and I don't see how they're ever going to be released unless some Democrat comes in there and changes his mind. But Obama didn't. They're still there. Then there's 5 others that were to be released. They had approval for release, but because of various factors, the Obama administration didn't get them out in time, and Trump won't release them. So that's 5 more. So that's 31 out of the 40. 7 are being prosecuted, and 2 are one is sentenced for crime and 1 is going to be sentenced. But essentially, very, very few people have been convicted of anything in Guantanamo. Out of 780 people, there have been only 8 convictions. So there's really, most of the people in Guantanamo, they just released over time.
I know I'm not going to be the first one to make this comparison, but when you describe the 26 detainees at Guantanamo Bay who are forever prisoners because the evidence they have against them is based on torture, so they know they can never use the evidence they have, and yet they still think they're too dangerous to let go. I mean, again, I'm not the first one to make this comparison, but it's like a Franz Kafka novel.
It's not limited to those 26, Mitch. I think a lot of people say that a lot of Guantanamo is not unlike that.
Yeah, so 26 forever. Do you think that Guantanamo Bay is not talked about as much today as previously because there are now 40 people in there rather than hundreds of people as there used to be?
Yes, but before, and I just want to back up because it's not just these 26 who have been there for 18 years and probably will die there. There were many, many men, Mitch, who were there for a decade or longer. So it isn't even a decade, even a year of detention without charges and trial is abominable and against the American ethic and law. So I don't want to just limit it to 26, say that's Kafkaesque. The fact is many of these men were held for years and years and decades, and they should also be acknowledged. Even though they were ultimately released, they were never charged, never tried, never convicted, nothing.
In our conversations that we've been having about executive power concerning war powers and just the expanding role that the president has taken on, it's always upon precedents that have occurred before, and then you sort of build upon that precedent, even creating new precedents that are available to future presidents. Do you think that there is, especially since this hasn't really, I guess, hasn't really been reined in despite the Supreme Court decisions, that there are precedents now that could lead further acts like this in the future under different circumstances?
Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, of course, because people got away with it. Bush got away with it. He got away with it. And Obama didn't really rein it in on some level. Obama said he was going to rein in the executive power, but he really didn't. He extended it, and he also fought the courts to make sure the courts didn't release any of the men. Obama wanted the power to release the men. So, it's kind of interesting, and I don't know this, of course, and I never will, but I've always thought that, the president might say he cares about doing the right thing, and in Obama's case, I think he really did care about doing the right thing. But when you're president, there's a lot else going on, and you look at a larger picture. And I guess Obama looked at a larger picture and looked at executive power and said, "Why should he rein that in? It's useful to him." And I think any executive would see that, no matter how good.
Rarely will a president rein in his own power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think so. I think you need. So yeah, I think
you need Congress to do it.
You need Congress to do it. That's right. Exactly. You need exactly.
Congress hasn't done anything on Guantanamo Bay. I mean, they're impeaching the president right now. You can make an argument. This is an attempt to rein in overall a president that you're afraid is out of control. But concerning Guantanamo Bay itself.
I haven't seen that Congress has done much in terms of reining in the president on Guantanamo Bay. No, I haven't seen it.
And Donald Trump, has anyone been released from Guantanamo Bay since
There was
Donald
one
Trump?
person that was, there was a plea bargain that would allow a Saudi to be released after he testified at some trial. And the trial went beyond Obama's administration, and so Trump was now president, and there was a question of whether Trump would honor that plea bargain, but he ultimately did release one man back to Saudi. So it was 41 when Obama left office, and then it became 40 when Trump didn't stop that plea bargain agreement.
But Trump campaigned and trying to fill it. He said he would fill Guantanamo Bay back up.
With more bad dudes. And one of the things I feared, but apparently didn't happen, I feared that if we did go to war in Iran and we had captors, I fear that, who knows, Trump might decide to send him to...
Still a place that could happen.
Well, I hope not.
Yeah. But it could be. That's my point.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? Trump might decide, he could do it, and
I mean, I don't think it's beyond the possibility if we did go back to war, if we, let's say, did have an all-out war with Iran, that Guantanamo Bay would be used to hold people that they deemed to be too dangerous.
Well, I think people felt it was a secure place, and it worked in lots of ways for the government because it was close to Washington, D.C. They could fly there quickly, and they had access in ways that they wouldn't have in other locations. So, I think that's right.
And as the title of your book, A Place Outside the Law, what does that mean? Why is Guantanamo Bay considered outside the law?
It was selected. It's interesting. The administration decided that they needed a place to house I guess because I think you read my book, Mitch, but maybe listeners don't. But after 9/11, the U.S. dropped flyers over Afghanistan and said, "We'll pay you for Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters." And so Afghans who were very poor pretty much grabbed anyone, and Pakistanis too, pretty much grabbed anyone who was not local, who was not somebody they knew, or a tribal enemy, and brought them to the U.S. military and said, "Here's an Taliban or an Al-Qaeda fighter," and we purchased those people. We paid $3,000 to $5,000 a person for each of those people, or for most of those people. And so Afghans and Pakistanis got rich selling these people to us, and we took them all because apparently Cheney wanted to fill up Guantanamo, which we'll talk about why they was chosen, to show he was tough. But anyway, that's who many of these people are. They're people who were grabbed and sold to us. And we then need to house them somewhere. And what the U.S. government wanted to do is find a place to house them where they wouldn't have the right to bring a habeas action to challenge the detentions in federal court. And there was a case in 1944 that seemed to say that if you were outside the U.S., you had no right to challenge your habeas in federal court. So they looked for places outside the U.S., And they thought of ships, but ships weren't large enough to hold all these men. And they thought of other countries, but there were some human rights issues in Europe, if they held them in Europe, bases in Europe, where which conflict and interfere. And then they realized Guantanamo to them was very safe. It was on Cuban soil, and they pretty much controlled the Guantanamo naval base of 40 square miles. And they felt it was outside the U.S., and therefore the detainees would never have a right to challenge their detentions. And so it was essentially a place outside the law. And the administration officials, we interviewed people who worked for George Bush's attorneys, and they were certain that this was a really safe place that the government could never, or the courts could never interfere with. They could do what
and they
wanted
told you
there.
this.
He said he was shocked when the Supreme Court in 2004 in the Rasool case said they had the right to challenge their detentions. He said the administration was blindsided. They never expected that.
And who's he?
Give me a moment. I'll remember his name. It's someone we interviewed, and he's in my book, but I can't remember his name at the moment.
If it comes back, just let us know.
I will tell you for sure. Yeah, it's not a secret.
This is Letters on Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and we are in conversation with Peter Jan Honigsberg. Peter Jan Honigsberg is professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law and founder and director of Witness to Guantanamo. He is the author of a book, A Place Outside the Law, Forgotten Voices from Guantanamo. For our listeners in the San Francisco Bay Area, Peter Jan Honigsberg will be speaking in Berkeley on February 4th, which is a Tuesday, so still a couple weeks from now. But he'll be at the Hillside Club in Berkeley, which is at 2286 Cedar Street. It'll begin at 7:30 p.m. So again, that's Tuesday, February 4th at the Hillside Club in Berkeley, and we will give these details throughout the program. So if you missed them here, get ready. We'll announce it again a little bit later. I want to go back to something you said, because I did read that part in your book about offering some, I think you said $3,000 to $5,000 to Pakistanis and Afghanis for them to turn who they think are our enemies over to the United States. You called it a bounty.
It was a bounty. It was a ransom bounty, absolutely. And it's not so much who they think it was.
I don't think people know this about that part.
I don't think so either. It's always shocking when I tell people that. People don't know that. It's always shocking. I mean, that we purchased these people.
I'll tell you, I've covered Guantanamo Bay for a number of years, even on Capitol Hill. I did not know it until I saw it in your book.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, that could be that could be on me. That could be my fault. But still, I mean, that is shocking to learn about that.
It is shocking, and it's shocking because it's so much outside the way American values itself, and there was, when we first heard it, we didn't quite believe it, and then we heard it again and again from detainee after detainee. They knew, they saw, and it became a thing.
And that's how you learned about it, because you heard it from detainees.
I heard it from detainees. In fact, one detainee who I believe he was very, very smart, he said to me they paid $30,000 for him. And I believe that he was kept in isolation for more than a year before he, quote, broke, he told us. And he spoke English, so he was valuable to the administration because they thought they'd get something from him. And he said they paid $30,000 from him. So, yeah, I think it was shocking.
$30,000.
$30,000 for him. That's what he told us.
That's a ton of money to somebody in Afghanistan, I imagine.
The Afghan average income at that time in 2001 was $800. So all these people need to do is sell one person with $3,000, and they just had income for the next 5 years, So, yeah, it was hugely valuable to just grab people off the street. And the people they grabbed were people who they didn't know. They were people who were strangers from other countries who were basically somebody they didn't owe any friendship with, and they were worth something. And in fact, like I said, they sold tribal enemies too. They sold, it was not particularly discriminatory in the sense they grabbed anyone who suited them.
Did you talk to government officials about this?
Government officials? Actually, we interviewed a few government officials who were aware of what I'm telling you. But the officials we interviewed were people who want to speak with us. I didn't speak to people who in the government otherwise know.
But they confirmed to you as well.
A few of them did confirm that they had heard that. Now, they didn't hear it from detainees because, right, but they had heard that. Yes, a few of them had heard that.
Wow. So how did that play out? Did the United States end up detaining people for years at Guantanamo Bay just because somebody sold somebody else in a way
correct.
For the bounty without even fully vetting?
I mean, you know about the Uyghurs who are Muslims,
the Chinese Uyghurs
from China, and they're a different. They've been, as you probably know, very much discriminated against right now in China. In fact, are kept in internment camps in China. 1 million of them are. Well, 22 Uyghurs were sold to the U.S. government. Back in the military back in 2001, and everyone knew, and the U.S. government knew immediately that the Uyghurs were innocent. The Uyghurs' issues were with China. They were not with the U.S. In fact, they were very grateful when the U.S. military took them because they felt we were on their side. And in fact, we just kept them in Guantanamo anyway, even though we knew they were innocent. We didn't release the first 5 Uyghurs until 4 years later in 2006, and we didn't release the last 3 Uyghurs until 2013, more than a decade after they were first purchased by the U.S. And everyone knew in the U.S. government that the Uyghurs were innocent, and we still kept them.
That's amazing. I do remember all the stories about the Uyghurs between 2008 and 2013. It did become an issue. Even then, though, I don't remember it being reported that they were purchased. So I just keep going back to that.
I know. Why would the government put a big sign saying we bought these people, right? I mean...
Right, of course. Yeah. So tell me about this project that you are working on. You filmed.
Yeah, I filmed. You know, what's interesting is there was no one else has done this kind of work. And there was some oral histories done audio, but I felt they had to be on film because if you think about it, when you watch somebody on film, they might say one thing, but if you watch their eyes and their facial expressions and even their body movements, you see something else. And I thought it was really important that, we had people who would be laughing, but you could see in their eyes they were really sad. And that was really important for me. And so filming costs a lot more money than audio like we're doing here, as you know. But ultimately, I thought it was necessary. And I'll tell you where that came from. My father barely escaped the Nazis in Austria in 1939. And Steven Spielberg started the Shaw Foundation in 1980s, 1990s, because there were Holocaust deniers, and he wanted to document that, in fact, the Holocaust did exist. So he had people interview on film everyone who was a survivor from the Holocaust. And my father was interviewed, and I happened to be present when he was interviewed in his home. And I watched the interview, and I watched my father on film, and I thought that was really powerful. And so when 2008 came around, and I decided to do this project, and I can tell you why I decided to do it on film, because I thought that is the power and that is what's necessary. And I was so inspired by the way Spielberg did that with my father and 40,000 other people that they interviewed on the Holocaust.
And your effort here is to ensure this is not.
Excuse me?
And your effort here is to ensure this is not forgotten.
That's right, exactly. And I'm glad you asked that, Mitch, because I think it's really important. Back in 2008, when Barack Obama was a candidate and John McCain was a candidate for president, both of them said they want to close Guantanamo. And President Bush at that time said he also he thought it was a good idea to close Guantanamo. So I felt, okay, it looks like the meeting of the minds are going to close Guantanamo no matter who's elected. And if we don't document it, as you just said, if it's not documented and if it's not documented on film, it'll fade away and into the dustbin of history, and no one will ever remember it. This is one of the darkest periods in American history, really, and it needed to be documented. It couldn't just be forgotten. And so I was very fortunate, but there's a man here in the Bay Area who has his own foundation, and a woman I know knew him, and she asked him if he would help me start this work. And he gave me enough money to go to 5 countries in the summer of 2009, interview 16 detainees on film. And that gave me some credibility to then get money from larger foundations. And we went to 20 countries around the world interviewing people over a decade. And luckily, we got money, enough money. We raised more than $1 million, $5 million, $6 million, $7 million over time. And most of the money, Mitch, might be interesting to you, given the way you're asking questions, comes from the UK. We got very little money from the U.S. foundations.
Why do you think that is?
I think that is because U.S. foundations didn't want to deal with Guantanamo. I think most people don't want to deal with Guantanamo. It's kind of like what you asked earlier. Most people would rather just not think about Guantanamo. And I will tell you something interesting. When I would tell people the work I'm doing, most of them would say, but Guantanamo is closed. I said, well, why do you think that? They said, well, Obama said he's closing it. I said, well, in fact, he said it 4 times. He never did close it. And people just don't want to think about it, so they just figure he closed it and that's the end of it. And what's interesting, whenever we went overseas to other countries to interview detainees who were sent to all countries around the world, other people in those countries would be so fascinated with Guantanamo. They would ask us so many questions. They were so interested in Guantanamo. To them, it was a stain on America that they knew, and so many of them loved America, and they felt, we did the wrong thing there. But Americans don't want to go there.
I suspect Obama would say, I tried to close it. Congress stopped me.
I'm glad you asked. Can I answer that?
That's why I put it out there.
Congress didn't stop him. Congress did stop him only because he signed the legislation. It was the military authorization bills each year, and the Republicans inserted a clause saying that he could not close Guantanamo. He didn't have to sign that bill. He could have vetoed it, or he could have gone to Mitch McConnell and said, you take that clause out or I'm not signing it. And he could have, gotten down and dirty with him. That's his job. That's his job as president to do that. But he didn't. He just signed the bill. And then he said, oh, they're tying my hands. And then the next year the bill came again, and he signed the bill. He said, oops, they're tying my hands. He could have fought back. He could have said, I'm not, take this out and let's negotiate, but he never did that.
And Trump, do you think Trump is just ignoring Guantanamo?
Totally
like
right
else?
now.
Is that
but
what's happening?
At this point, I think he has other fish to fry and other concerns. But if something came up, I'm sure,
That's the danger of it. It's
a real day. It's still there.
It's ready to take people in.
I mean, I don't want to go there, but it's still there. You're right, Mitch. It's still there. It's still there.
I was surprised not too long ago. A former neighbor of mine, I live in an apartment building. I didn't know a lot about him, but we were always friendly in the hallway. And then one day he's moving out. I'm like, oh, where are you going? Guantanamo Bay. I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, I'm being stationed over there. I didn't even realize he was in the military.
Wow.
Didn't even realize they were still sending military personnel to Guantanamo Bay.
Absolutely. They have a huge contingent of military personnel there for these 40 detainees, and also to protect the base,
Do they still have sort of their little mini civilization there with Burger Kings, or I don't know if it was actually a Burger King.
Yeah, they have a McDonald's and they have a Starbucks. Yeah, totally. It's a real community with a school, I believe, also. Yeah.
Again, we are in conversation with Peter Jan Honigsberg. Peter Jan Honigsberg is professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law and the founder and director of Witness to Guantanamo. He is the author of the book, A Place Outside the Law, Forgotten Voices from Guantanamo. For listeners in the San Francisco Bay Area, you can see Peter Jan Honigsberg speak on Tuesday, February 4th at 7:30 p.m. at the Hillside Club in Berkeley, 2286 Cedar Street. Again, that's Tuesday, February 4th at 7:30 p.m. at the Hillside Club in Berkeley. We'll give these details as we wrap up at the end of the program. Tell me more about the project you work on, because I'm interested in it, because you talk to detainees. I want to know what that experience was like, especially when you go to 20 different countries to do it. You also speak to attorneys.
Prison guards. Interrogators. Interpreters. Mm-hmm. We spoke to a man who was called the King of Torture. We talked to interrogators.
Who was he?
His name, Damien Corsetti, was in Afghanistan. He never interrogated in Guantanamo. All the detainees were first brought to Afghanistan to 2 camps Bagram and Kandahar in Afghanistan, and then they were shipped or transported to Guantanamo. And he worked in Afghanistan, and he was a young man, and actually he was essentially told to do whatever he needed to do to get intel. I will back up a little bit here, Mitch. It's important to understand that the Bush administration was really afraid that there's going to be another 9/11 attack, and they couldn't afford to have another 9/11 attack on their watch. And so they weren't that concerned about anything with the men they captured or they held except to get intel. So these people in the front lines in Afghanistan were told, get the intel, whatever. And he was not trained as an interrogator. He was very smart, but he was not trained as an interrogator. But they basically put him in there because they had no interrogators who, at that time, there were very few trained because they didn't expect a war. And and he said, look, he actually even said, some of the stuff he asked me to do seems to me to go against youth conventions, which he had been trained on when he first joined the military. And so they said, okay, speak to some lawyers for the military JAG offices, Judge Advocate General offices, and the Judge Advocate General offices, the JAG offices, told them, no, there's no violations of law here, and that caused him to, he couldn't fight back, and so he did mistreat the men, and so did the other interrogators in Afghanistan, and they did it to, quote, get intel. And when the people were sent to Guantanamo, at the beginning they were still physically mistreated badly, but subsequently most of the mistreatment in Guantanamo became psychological torture, which to me is worse. And I think people should understand that. They always talk about waterboarding, which never happened in Guantanamo except by the CIA, which might have done it in a separate building, but it's never been documented. But to me, the psychological torture is worse. And it's interesting, one of the detainees we interviewed said, when you pull the knife out, you begin to heal. But when you're psychologically tortured, like in isolation, you never heal. And there's a lot of truth to that, I feel. And so a lot of detainees told us that they thought Guantanamo was a psychological prison more than a physical torture prison. And so when people always think of torture, they think of physical torture. But the fact is, psychological torture to many people, including me, if you want to make a comparison, and maybe you shouldn't, can be worse.
Solitary confinement.
Solitary confinement
is torture.
Torture, absolutely.
There's research on this.
That's right.
We need each other just to create a sense of reality. And when Terry Coopers, I think is his name, a psychologist here in the Bay Area that studies this, told me once that when you don't have that, you start to drift, including into paranoia. So solitary confinement, what else constitutes psychological torture?
Well, what I heard, there was something called frequent flyer, and they did this often with juveniles. There were quite a few juveniles in Guantanamo. It was never quantified, but there was quite a few. And what they would do is take these men and put them in a cell for 2 or 3 hours, and the men would settle in, and then they would come back. The prison guards would come back and say, okay, now it's time to move. And then move them to another cell. And the prisoner would settle in for 2 or 3 hours, and the prison guard would come back and say, okay, time to move again. And they move them to a third cell. And 2 or 3 hours later, they move them a fourth time. And they do that for 2 or 3 weeks nonstop. So the prisoner never had a chance.
Every few hours.
Mm-hmm. Every few hours. And the prisoner never had a chance to settle in and sleep for but an hour each time, if that, and just get moved. And that would go on for 2 or 3 weeks to kind of break them. That was one other torture that they did. Another one they did is they would take detainees and say, okay, you get to go home now. And they'd give them civilian clothes and say, you got to wait in these cells, which is a more convenient cell, until the plane comes to take you back home. And they wait there. They wait there. And after a week, the prison guards come back and say, sorry, I guess it's not going to happen. You have to go back into the prison.
Wow. I mean, you could relate to that. I mean, that's never happened to me, but, Think about being stood up on a date. Right? After a few minutes, you're like, "Oh, is this going to show up?" Starts to suck. I mean,
especially when you go home and see your family, and you're finally going to get out of this hellhole, and then then you're going back, and you break. And they want people to they wanted people to break because they wanted people not to be resistant. You know.
Any sense of where these techniques came from? Are they just trying these here at Guantanamo?
Well, they were. So there were people who believed they were trying them out in Guantanamo to see what worked. There was one man who was who worked at the ACLU who actually had worked in Palestine and Israel before he came to America, and he said he had seen similar work, in Israeli prisons of the Palestinians. So he felt that we might have learned something from the Israelis, but I don't know that for a fact. He just said that to us.
That's what he said.
Yeah.
Was there a story in here that stood out to you?
There are many stories. I mean, because a large part of the book is stories, because I really felt you need to see the humanity of the people, the humanity of detainees who were able to withstand all the torture they suffered, and just as importantly to me, the humanity of the people who were on the other side, how they dealt with it and what happened to them. And I'd like to tell one story, but I will tell, the king of torture that I mentioned to you earlier, he apologized on film each time we interviewed him, and he's the only person we interviewed 3 times. I kept going back to interview him because he was such a compelling character, because he wanted to apologize, he wanted to get better, and he realized he did the wrong thing. And so there was humanity there, and he understood that, and he was smart that way. And one story about humanity that is worth sharing with you is about somebody who was a whistleblower, a young man who was a lawyer who worked at Guantanamo and was a liaison with the Pentagon. And one day the Pentagon got a letter from lawyers in New York, and the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, saying, "Could you send us the names of all the detainees that are left in Guantanamo?" There were approximately 500 at that time. And the Pentagon said, "No, we're not. It's classified." And that's actually in violation of the Geneva Conventions. It should have been released. And this man, Matt Diaz, in Guantanamo, was copied on that. And he said to himself, he also had known, he was a lawyer, and he knew about the Geneva Convention. And he said, the loved ones, these men's families, did not know they were in Guantanamo. They had disappeared into Guantanamo. A lot of the people, the families, thought these men had died. Yeah. In the bombings in Afghanistan, they thought they got killed. So he wanted to let the families know, look, your sons, your fathers, your husbands are alive. They're here. So he decided he was on the wrong side of things, and he was going to do the right thing. So he downloaded all the names, cut them up into small little bits, put them into a envelope with a greeting card, and sent
so like printed them out and then cut them up? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And shrunk them, and then cut it up so that it would fit into a greeting card, the 500 names. And then he sent the greeting card to the lawyer in New York, and then he left the base the next morning. And it took a year for the government to figure out who he was and what he had done, but then they arrested him. But he stood up. He believed humanity mattered, the families and these men mattered, and they should know. And he said he knew, he didn't want to get caught, but he knew that he needed to do something. And so his story is one of the important stories in my book. Matt Diaz. There's a nice...
What would happen to him eventually?
Well, eventually he got 6 months in prison. He could have gotten actually 24 years. So the military jury clearly understood where he was coming from, and they gave him a break. But Kansas, where he was a lawyer, took away his license to practice law. So he ended up working as a paralegal in New York City. But it's funny, there's a great ending, Mitch, when I wanted to write, I wrote about him, and I wanted a photo of him in my book. So I wrote to him and I said, "Do you have a photo you can send me?" And he said, "How's this?" And he said, "This is a photo of me just being sworn into the New York bar. I just became a New York lawyer." So that was a really nice way to end that story. Yeah. And now he's practicing law as a defense attorney in New York.
Are these interviews publicly available?
Yes, they will be. We have clips of these interviews. We have more than 150, 200 clips of these interviews, like, 1 or 2 minutes of many of these people we interviewed on our witnesstoguantanamo.com website. We can't put up the full interviews because we didn't have the money for the internet to put up the 2-3 hour interviews. However, we donated all the interviews, over 300 hours of film, to Duke University Human Rights Archive, and they're going to post almost all the full-length interviews online starting this summer of 2020. So people will be able to see the full interviews soon.
Are there lawmakers in Congress that are pushing for the closure of Guantanamo? Do you know?
I think at one point there might have been, but I don't know if anyone is doing it now.
It's just fallen off the radar. It's off everyone's radar.
It's off everyone's radar.
And we just passed the 18th anniversary of its opening in the war of terrorism anyways.
It's fallen off the radar so much so that when I wrote an op-ed piece for several newspapers, no one took it on the 18th anniversary. It just wasn't. No one took my op-ed pieces. It just wasn't important to them.
This was just last week, right?
That's last week. I sent it out to several newspapers around the country, even local papers. They all rejected it or weren't interested.
And what did you say in the op-ed?
I said that we need to look at what we had done, and because of the rule of law that we violated and human rights that we violated, but I thought just importantly, we need to also understand what the people there, what they see when they look back at us, and what do they see? And then I used the example of the migrant children who Trump put in cages. What did Trump see when he put them in cages, and what do those migrant children see when they look back at America? And then I asked, when Roosevelt put those Japanese Americans in the internment camps, what did Roosevelt see when he put them in there, and what did those Japanese Americans see when they look back at us? And no one was interested.
But I've heard it said that history is the struggle against forgetting.
Which is why I did this project, Mitch. Exactly. I mean, maybe it'll still be forgotten, but at least there'll be 300 hours of interviews online, and as long as the internet exists, for people to see these stories.
Yeah, I don't know, of course, but I suspect one day it'll come back into public consciousness. There's definitely been what I think I would call it an Iraq war fatigue for people. I mean, we're still in Iraq. There's still a war going on. We're still in Afghanistan, and it's off the radar as well. And people got tired about it. But I guess I assume one day in the future it'll come back into focus of what have we done.
Yeah, I'll be dead by then, Mitch, but I think that's true. I think one day someone will pull out my book and say, wow, this is kind of interesting. I didn't know this. But yeah, I think that's right. I think for history it needs to be done.
Peter Jan Honigsberg has been our guest. Peter Jan Honigsberg is professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law and the founder and director of The Witness to Guantanamo. He is the author of the book, A Place Outside the Law, Forgotten Voices from Guantanamo. For our listeners in the San Francisco Bay Area, Peter Jan Honigsberg will be speaking at a KPFA-sponsored event, which will be February 4th, a couple weeks from now, which is a Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. at the Hillside Club in Berkeley, 2286 Cedar Street. Again, he'll be speaking at the Hillside Club on February 4th, starting at 7:30 p.m. in Berkeley. Peter Jan Honigsberg, thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure, Mitch. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And that does it for Letters and Politics. The show is produced by Deanna Martinez. Kirsten Thomas is our engineer. You can find archives of our previous shows online at kpfa.org. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I thank you for listening.
Richard Wolff has just published a new book, Understanding Socialism. It destroys false narratives, confronts historic failures, reveals the way to a fresh socialism based on workplace democracy. Cornel West says Wolff's new book is the most accessible, reliable treatment we have of what socialism is, was, should be. Laura Sanders says it explains socialism in a way that's not only smart, but makes the rest of us feel smart. Chris Hedges says Wolff provides a sane and just socialist alternative to capitalist exploitation. Richard Wolff will discuss this new book Friday evening, February 28th at First Church, Berkeley, 2407 Dana Street. There's wheelchair access. Sabrina Jacobs will host this benefit for KPFA and Democracy at Work. Tickets at brownpapertickets.com or supportive bookstores.
KPFA, KPFB, Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, 97.5 K248BR in San